not just as men, but all the people in our society really need to think about what are the messages that we're giving young boys around being boys and being men. So I love to say that around, like when you look at kids that are 2 and 3 years old, we treat them quite often fairly similar. If they cry, if they're upset, they're angry, we let them have their emotions and encourage it. And then around age 4 or 5, what happens is boys and girls start hearing very different messages. So if a little girl falls down and scrapes her knee and cries, we coddle them, we nurture them. It's okay, and we support them. Boys, we start saying, hey, brush that dirt off, suck it up. And so they start hearing this message, whether consciously or unconsciously, of, oh, when I show certain emotions, particularly sadness, anger, things like that, that's not good. That's not what I should be doing. And so they begin to get this message of, oh, I shouldn't do those things because that's not what I see the men in my life doing.
Welcome back to the Better Than Rich Show. You are in for another treat today with Christopher Veal. And Christopher is a former Marine. Really, there's no such thing as a former Marine. Once a Marine, always a Marine, and combat veteran, and 25 years of experience in talent and leadership development. He has the Vulnerable Man podcast. So many of you might follow his work already, but he serves his clients. He's an executive coach, leadership consultant, and he has an awesome message. We get into everything from masculinity to inclusive leadership. Andrew asked some really great questions around that. We get into what is the unhealthy masculinity. How does that hurt society? We talk a little bit about his book and what it means to be a whole man and what are the habits of a whole man. And you should definitely listen to the end and you'll learn a little bit about the Whole Man Evolving Masculinity book and the Vulnerable Man podcast. We talk a little bit about how to stay in touch with Christopher. But if you like deep conversation, if you like exploring topics like toxic masculinity and what is the opposite of that, you're going to really love this episode, because what's beyond the business and the vehicle and the leadership, it's who we're becoming in the process of self-discovery. And I think this is one of those episodes that you might think to yourself, man, can I be a better person? Can I be a better human after listening to this conversation with Christopher? So get ready for another great episode in the Better Than Rich Show with Christopher Veal.
Welcome back, Better Than Rich Show listeners. Today we have a special guest. His name is Mr. Christopher Veal. Christopher, how are you doing, man?
Glad to be here, gentlemen. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mike, how are you today?
I'm doing good. Excited for this conversation as well. After reading Christopher's bio, how could I not be? So this is it's going to be a great convo.
Yeah, absolutely. And Christopher, you have an incredible story. I can't wait to dive in, but I also just love the topic that you speak on, right? Masculinity. And, from my perspective, masculinity is a little bit in crisis these days. Mm-hmm. And I think that what you're speaking on is super important and super timely. But give me the premise, give the listeners the premise of the whole man. What does that mean to you, and why masculinity, and why is it important today?
Right. It's just that simple question, right? Really the core of it is what I talk about with masculinity is that we need to evolve the way that we're holding masculinity. So in the book that I wrote, The Whole Man, it looks at what holds men in what I call unhealthy masculinity in the 21st century, and the things that keep us from feeling safe in embracing greater vulnerability in our lives. In the book, I explore some of the outdated views and constructs around what it means to be a man, whatever that is, and the things that keep us closed off and really hold us back from bringing all of ourselves. And I particularly chose the word evolving in it because there are some great qualities about being a man. And when I looked at the way I saw it growing up, it was a very narrow definition of what you had to do and the way you had to act to be a man. And what I know is it's expansive. And so what I want to do is help us keep the parts that are needed and are helpful, but then also bring in elements that we're going to need to go forward and solve the challenges we're facing in the future. And that's really what evolution is about in nature. When organisms evolve, they keep the parts they need and they adopt others so that they can thrive in their new environments. And one of the things that I think is most important in this whole process is, shifting from this idea of either or mindset, which is what a lot of unhealthy masculinity is, and adopting more of an both and type of mindset. One of the classic examples I use is growing up, a lot of kids that are my age, I'm in my early 50s, but the men modeled examples of I can be a breadwinner or a caregiver. And really, that's not serving anymore. And so how do we move to the mindset of, I can be a breadwinner and a caregiver? And the more we can get people adopting those kinds of thinking, the more we can address some of the challenges that we're facing.
So my curiosity stems in, I read The Boy Crisis. We also had Connor Beaton on the podcast. He has a really great book, Men's Work. Mm-hmm. And we've had many conversations around this. So my question would be, at what stage, in your opinion, does the boy become the man? And at what point is it the responsibility of the man to begin Sherpa, like being a Sherpa for these boys to help them enter into manhood? So like that, like I'd like to hear your paradigm on some of the transitions there.
Sure. I'll take the second part of it first, because I think that's a more crucial piece. And not just as men, but all the people in our society really need to think about what are the messages that we're giving young boys around being boys and being men. So I love to say that around, like when you look at kids that are 2 and 3 years old, we treat them quite often fairly similar. If they cry, if they're upset, they're angry, we let them have their emotions and encourage it. And then around age 4 or 5, what happens is boys and girls start hearing very different messages. So if a little girl falls down and scrapes her knee and cries, we coddle them, we nurture them. It's okay, and we support them. Boys, we start saying, hey, brush that dirt off, suck it up. And so they start hearing this message, whether consciously or unconsciously, of, oh, when I show certain emotions, particularly sadness, anger, things like that, that's not good. That's not what I should be doing. And so they begin to get this message of, oh, I shouldn't do those things because that's not what I see the men in my life doing. So I think it's important that we are setting examples and showing examples of a broader range of ways for men to be men so that they can grow up seeing that. So I think that's, to address the second part of the question, like it starts almost from day one. With the piece about the transition, one of the things interesting is as I was researching this book, there are a number of cultures around the world where they have some kind of ritualistic or ceremony or something that marks this transition of a boy becoming a man. And back in 2017, I gave a TED talk, and there was another man named Ron Fritz, I believe his name was, who talked about this concept of rituals. And they did it with their kids. But we don't really have anything that marks it here. And I'll speak in North America because that's where I live. We say when you turn 18, you're a man. But what does that mean? And I don't think that boys or we really know what does that mean, and what do they understand the difference of what that transition now means. They look at what they see in TV and in movies and they go, oh, well, I see men being men there. Again, I use the air quotes because what is that? And so I have to do those things to be a man. And so we don't have anything clearly that delineates it. And I'm not sure if that's what we need to get back to, but I think there's a way to help men understand, young boys make that transition of, oh, now I'm a man, and understanding what that encompasses.
Yeah. Well, I love the idea of rituals, and it's something that we tried out. I have an 8-year-old, and so we went on our first camping trip together, solo, kind of no technology. And, it was a success. I gave him some journal questions. So it was kind of fun to do that. Mike comes from the Jewish community, so obviously they have the bar mitzvah, right. So there's different ideas, but I think, I never had any of that. I didn't have anything. I was just like, boom, you're a boy. And then I hit puberty and it's like, okay, now
all bets are off.
My whole world has changed, and I wasn't exactly like guided, all that, let's say intentionally through that process. Then you go into college, same thing, right? And you're exposed to all these different things, and next thing you know, you're in the workforce. So, it's just kind of one big, slosh that you're going through, and it's tough to delineate. I do want to ask about this emotion piece, right? You mentioned kids getting treated differently, men shutting down from their emotions. I know is a big part of, what you speak to and helping men get reconnected with their emotions, I imagine, in some ways. Talk to me a little bit about emotions, why it's important for men to be connected to their emotions, and what do you see there?
Absolutely. Well, first, I want to say I love that you took your son camping and actually introduced him to the idea of journaling, whether that's the first time you did it or not. I think that's a powerful example you're setting, because from what I've experienced, when I take time to slow down and connect with my thoughts, it helps me get really grounded as well. So I just want to say I love that you are doing that with him at that early age. Yeah. To the piece about emotions, I think a large part of it is as as boys and young men, we aren't often taught how to really understand and be with emotions. Again, there's a few emotions that are appropriate for men to share, apparently. We can be happy, we can be angry in very limited ways and express certain ways, but a lot of the other emotions, if we show them, we tend to get shunned or looked down on by other men in particular. And so other men are the worst perpetrators in this process. And I think what needs to happen is we need to start teaching all kids how to have a little better understanding around not just emotions, because here's the thing, we are all emotional creatures. We're human. We have emotions. And what happens is when we have them and we try and stifle them, that just tends to build up. It's like a pressure cooker that you keep cranking the lid down on, and eventually it's going to blow up. And if we start teaching young boys in particular how to not just have emotions, but to process them, I think that is a way to help us. Now, one of the things that often happens is people label emotions as good or bad. And actually, I believe emotions are neither. They're just emotions. How we respond to them and how we act, that's what puts that label of good or bad. But sad is no better an emotion than happy or exalted. So it's how do we help people recognize that you can have this breadth of experience, and it allows us to really have the emotions and let them move through us. Because when we stifle them, that's when they get stuck, and that's when it creates problems. So it's a multiple approach thing. The other thing that I want to add too is we need to increase our vocabulary around emotions. Because a lot of the times, if I ask people, what are some of the emotions you have, they're going to give you a list of about 5 or 6, and that's it. And really, if you look, if I say happy has lots of degrees. There can be excited, there can be exalted, there can be joyous, ecstatic. Like there's a lot of words, but if we only say happy, that gives us this way to experience it when there's so much more. So how do we help people become more conversant in what their emotions mean? So that's a long answer for your question. I hope I answered it.
Well, you're speaking exactly what where my curiosity was, is the spectrum of emotions, because people, you survey the public, the happiness advantage, and I just want to be happy. And it's like, what the hell does that even mean?
Right.
It's like, and then you go a little bit deeper. It's like progress brings happiness. Well, it's like, how do we create progress? What is the emotional spectrum of progress? Because I've failed forward many times in life, and in those emotions of failing forward were resentment, angst, worry, fear, like all these other emotions, but yet they were on the pathway towards happiness and making progress. But I don't think that's talked about enough. So, my curiosity then stems into, how do we make it tactical? How do we make it practical? How do we take a fail forward concept with progress, assuming that's that you believe the similar beliefs?
Absolutely.
But how do we take this concept of failing forward and progress brings happiness, using those loose words? What are the techniques? What's practical? What do we do? Is it I just sit there and and meditate and really pray that everything's going to just work out, and that's how it's going to, I'm assuming, obviously I'm a little tongue in cheek on that, but I'd like to hear you kind of riff on some of that, Christopher.
Sure. I love the idea of fail forward. And I think one of the things that I'd start with is, I think we have this culture of toxic happiness. And by that, I mean, there's this expectation that we're always going to be joyful and happy and whatever all the time. And that doesn't happen. I mean, I can speak from my experience. That hasn't always happened. Generally, I'm happy in life, but there are times when I'm sad. And if I don't let myself have that, then I'm shortchanging myself. But the idea of fail forward, I think it was John Maxwell that first introduced it. I know that's where I first read it. And I love that idea, because one of the problems we have is, I think we often equate that if I fail, that means I'm a failure. And actually, that's not true at all. And I'm sure I'm speaking to the choir on that. But I love the acronym FAIL is like first attempt in learning, or I say further attempt in learning, because I fail many times and it's not always just the first time. And one of the things that I do, particularly with my daughter, is try and encourage the mindset of try things. Don't expect that you're going to get them right every time. Sometimes you will, great. And if you don't, that doesn't become criticism or some kind of judgment of who you are. It's just that thing you tried didn't work in that way in that moment. And what did you learn, and how will you be different from it? And so I think that's another thing that we need to do is I continually come back to, what are the examples that we are giving people and that they're seeing? So if I only see examples of the success stories, we're going to talk about book recommendations. There's one that I will definitely have in there. But this idea, we see people suddenly become this overnight rags to riches story. But what we don't see is all the work they put in getting up to it. And so we go, oh, look, they became an instant success. And because I haven't, I'm a failure. And that doesn't serve us. So we need to show that people will make mistakes, that they'll grow. And how do they continue to learn and develop as a person? Or do they become stagnant and not go anywhere? And if that happens, then that in itself is a failure. So I'm not sure. Did I answer the question? Or maybe I went on a tangent too.
I think you answered it. I think it was great. Just getting connected to those different emotions, and then understanding that it's a journey. Certainly for me, I kind of grew up in a household where, Mom, if you're listening, don't take this personally. Where it's like, we kind of put on a happy face, Christopher, right? It's like, nothing to see here, no problems, and like, right. So it was a pretty good childhood. Don't get me wrong. It wasn't like there was like massive issues or anything. But when there were issues, like at least me, it was like, where's the rug and how do I hide it and not deal with it? And my wife's family was exactly the opposite. So of course we're together. And of course,
yes.
Yeah. And so of course, like she just wants to take the rug and throw everything. And then I'm oftentimes doing the opposite. And she has to remind me, like, life's not, always, sunshine and rainbows and lollipops. And so that's definitely something that I personally struggled with. And I think, it's like we just expect life to be perfect all the time. We're supposed to always go in an upward trajectory. Well, is that how life works? Is that how anything works? So I think that's really important. Yeah, one of the things that you talk about is vulnerability. And obviously vulnerability, masculinity, this idea. Obviously, Brene Brown's got some really good stuff on that. I want to hear Christopher's take, though. Like vulnerability, why does that matter? Because there is a man listening right now in the car or on the treadmill or wherever he's at, right? And there's a woman who's listening who maybe feels the same way. But it's like, I don't want to be vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
I wasn't raised to be vulnerable. I've already, I've woken up as a man or a woman in this society 30, 35, 40, 50, 60 years down the road now, and I'm pretty hardened in my ways. And you're telling me I got to get vulnerable, get back in touch with my emotions to become a whole man. Talk about why that's the case and what you see there.
Sure. Well, yeah, and Brene Brown is part of what started me on this journey. I found her work back in 2012, 2013, and that really just started me in the question. When I talk with men in particular, I like to say vulnerability is a 4-letter word for most men that we don't say in mixed company. And what I've discovered, so back in 2015, I started interviewing men one-on-one, asking 5 or 6 core questions about what got in the way of them being more vulnerable, in particular with other men. And really, it fell into 2 or 3 main buckets, but there was the idea of being seen as less than or feeling like they're going to be judged as the core pieces of it. And as I had the conversations with them, I would often ask them, okay, and if a good friend of yours, a buddy of yours shared something that he was struggling with, what would you think? And the majority of the answers were, wow, I'd have a lot of respect for him. I'd feel proud that he trusted me. My heart would go out to him. And then I would say, and so what gets in the way of you sharing and being more vulnerable with others? And they would just kind of sit there and have that kind of dumb look on their face. And they'd realize, that when they think about vulnerability in others, that they saw it as a strength. And when they think about being vulnerable, they saw it as a weakness. And so part of the work that I do, and I started focusing primarily on men because while women may not have all the answers, they're doing much better around it. They are much better at creating spaces where they allow each other to be vulnerable. But men, we don't do that. We feel like there's got to be this bro code of tough love. And it actually, what I know is men are wanting more of it. And what vulnerability gives us is, in a word, connection. When you see somebody who shares something, and it's maybe not their deepest, darkest secret. I never tell people, like, dump everything you have on somebody because they may not be ready for it. But when someone's willing to be a little bit vulnerable, it opens the space for greater connection. And you feel like you know a little bit more about the person. And what often happens as a byproduct is you're willing to be a little bit more vulnerable in return. And so what that does is it allows us to connect on a human level and be more in relationship with each other. So that's why I'm a big advocate for greater vulnerability. And I recognize that, again, a lot of unhealthy masculinity, this alpha male, when we think about the rules of the man box, I got to win at all costs. I can never fail. I can never show that I'm hurting or suffering, and dominate and win. And that's it. Right. And so all of that is counter to everything that's part of vulnerability. And part of the message that I like to share is vulnerability in itself is not weakness, but we often attribute it to being weak. And so how do we help not just men, but all people start to recognize that when they are willing to be a little more vulnerable, it opens things up and allows people to see into them and want to support them. I spent 9 years in the Marine Corps. So believe me, 6.5 years in construction, those were not areas where we talked about our feelings and vulnerability at all. And while I was successful in those areas, I also realized I didn't get to bring all of myself. Like I had to bring this, I'd go to work and I'd kind of be this version of Christopher. And then when I'd go home, I could be myself. And it was a lot of work and frankly, just frustrating. And so that's part of what started me on this process to writing this book and doing this work.
Well, I love that, Christopher. I think that's fantastic. I was actually I just got back from a retreat with 7 men. And so we call it the band. Okay. And we went together. Yeah. We went to a retreat in Georgia at a lake house. One of our friends that's a lake house there, and we just hung out for 3 days, man. Yeah. And in this group, it's like we're allowed to share anything, and it's 100% confidential. It's like even if you tell your wife and pillow talk, like you're kicked out. Like it's just 100%. You're not allowed to say, it's 100% confidential. You can share anything, and some of the stories that I'm hearing are like, well, everyone's got some shit going on, man. Right. We're all struggling in certain ways. And we always, I don't know, it's interesting because I'm struggling, you're struggling, Mike's struggling. We all have our own struggles. I don't know what they are, but I always project that they got it together, right? Yes. It's hard for me to see Christopher Veal right now looking at me, handsome as can be,
believe me, I got my own shit I'm dealing with.
Amazing, orator, speaking super clearly, and actually imagine that you have any struggles, right? So I'm always assuming that you have it all together that I'm interacting with. So it's just so cool to see, to create spaces like that. And some of the, some nights out on the balcony after dinner, it's like tears are coming down. People are sharing, really important stuff. So it's just having spaces like that is so critical. And if you're listening, you don't have spaces like that, you probably need to consider what that might look like. I know Mike has a question about, kind of the next phase of this or, kind of what you're seeing in society. Mike, what's coming up for you?
Well, I just wanted to piggyback off of what you're saying about creating these spaces, because I think back to my Tony Robbins experience walking across fire and hearing my mess is my message. And if I didn't truly own my mess is my message, I don't know if I would be able to be as much of a husband and a father as I've grown into, understanding and embracing that and dancing with that it's like all the stuff that I was hiding from, let me just actually bring it into the public. And one of my best friends, Doug, came to one of our Better Than Rich retreats, and he was in real dark spot, and it just had a really bad breakup. And he came to our retreat, and he fell in love with Doug at that retreat. Yeah. And that was the whole premise is he was so heartbroken from his relationship because that was the center of the paradigm that he was running his life by. It's let's put Doug at the center of the paradigm and fall in love with Doug. And he's been on this journey now since that retreat of just being in love with himself and doing the things that he loves. He spontaneously just took a trip and spontaneously started a different career path and started picking up dancing and meeting new people. And it's he's living his best life because he's fell in love with himself. And that stemmed from realizing that my mess is my message to my truth. And it's also my message to those around me. And I just felt compelled to bring his example. And we have many others inside of our community, but I don't know if you have a thread on that at all.
Well, here's something that's really important that you're both pointing to is community. And that's something that I talk about. That's an important piece because you think about even our ancestors, hunter-gatherers, like cavemen, but they gathered in groups. And there's something about it. We are hardwired for connection as people. But a lot of this unhealthy masculinity tells us we've got to be that solo lone adventurer. We've got to not need anybody and do it ourselves. And that's so counter to it. There's been a lot of articles coming out lately talking about the loneliness crisis, about, there was a study done where men, middle-aged, 30s and up, have fewer male friends. Some of them don't even have one close friend. And so I love that, Andrew, you talked about this group of men coming together. And part of what I'm imagining is it's not about everybody's got to solve the problems for everyone else, but even just knowing that I can come to this space and I can share what's going on and people are going to hear me and still love me for who I am because of it, that's transformational. And so the more we can create those spaces, like I want to echo for anybody listening, man, woman, however you identify, if you don't have it, find it. It's out there. Because as much as you think you're the only one, like Andrew said, you're not. There's other people struggling, and it may not be the same problem, and it doesn't have to be. Like, this isn't a pity party contest. My problems are worse than yours, but just knowing that others are hurting can help you feel like, oh, okay, maybe I'm not as bad off as I thought, or I feel a little better about it, even though it's a crappy situation. Okay, sorry, I interrupted there, Mike. I know you had a question, but I needed to say that.
So my question coming back, by the way, that's perfect. Is if I'm sitting here listening to this, what are the potential consequences of like me not taking action on falling in love with myself and being vulnerable and courageous enough to share my shit and put out my dirty laundry and find these safe spaces and find community? Like, what if I just say, you know what, screw that. Like, I don't want to go through that uncomfortable. I'm just going to stay on the course that I am. And life will take its course. I'm doing good. Hey, I'm at a 7 out of 10. I'll just stay a 7 out of 10 for the rest of my life, and I'll be okay.
Yeah.
What would you say to that?
The first thing I'd say is you're probably not at a 7 out of 10. You think you are, but you're probably not. And here's what I'll say. If you're happy with where you are, I'm not going to tell you need to do something different. Like, frankly, this isn't for everybody. I will say that doing this work, just like any kind of personal development, it's not easy. If it was, then everybody would be doing it. But what I'd offer is what's at risk. So loneliness, isolation, disconnection. Those are probably the biggest things. And with that unlocks so many other things. But, if you feel like you're doing fine, great. I'm not going to throw salt on your game. You do you, boo-boo. What I do know is that from being willing to lean in, from being willing to be vulnerable, even when it's not comfortable, as a matter of fact, most of the time it's not, what it's created is deeper, richer relationships in my life. It's created more connection. I've had more success because of it. There are people that will often hire me because I do executive coaching and say, I appreciate that you're willing to share where you've made mistakes and you've failed and you've learned, because it helps me feel like I don't have to be perfect. And so literally it's resulted in dollars in my pocket and work that I'm doing getting to help other people be better leaders. But what's at risk? I mean, frankly, your life. They've done some looking at how loneliness impacts our health as well. And it can actually shorten our lifespan if we don't have solid, meaningful connections in our lives. So that's potentially what you're losing out. And again, I always say, I'm not going to tell somebody that you need to be on the path that I'm on. But my invitation is be willing and be open to it a little bit, as opposed to just saying no right away, and see what it might have for you.
It's a great answer. And your life's at stake. And I think, especially, again, modern society, it's complex, It's a lot more complex than it used to be. It's hard to exactly know how to fit in. And there's this idea, obviously there is toxic masculinity. And also there's even some, I think, internalized shame that also has come around. I don't know if I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Christopher. I don't know specifically what your take is there, but there's also almost that other side where it's like, and sometimes men are shutting down some of their masculine traits because they see them as toxic. And I'm curious to hear that maybe a little bit as well. And maybe how you've seen this kind of branch into the broader society, how unhealthy masculinity hurts society, and, why this matters in this moment right now in the modern world. And there's all of this talk about, feminism and masculinity and the relationship there. And I've seen toxically masculine people. I've also seen kind of like men who have basically cut their balls off, Christopher, for lack of a better term. Yeah. And they're just neutered themselves, and they've cut off from their ambition. They've cut off from their drive. They've cut off from, they've internalized the messaging of toxic masculinity so much that they've actually feminized themselves, and they aren't, that's not their natural state. I'm not saying this is something that's actually natural for them. So they lose their purpose in life, if you will. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, because I think this is a hot topic, if you will, Christopher. So take it away.
there's a couple of pieces to it. I think one of it is about finding a healthy balance. Anytime you swing to one end of a pendulum spectrum, like you're probably not going to find good. So it's how do you find space for more of all to be possible? And that's why for me, I talk about this idea of expansive or both and type of thinking, because traditionally it's either or, and that really puts us in a limited space. Now, somebody told me probably about a year and a half ago that this work that I'm doing is really about gender equity. And at first I was like, no, like I'm not doing that. And what I realized is in a way it is, because if I'm able to help men connect with healthier masculinity, which does not mean we don't go out and hunt in the woods and do it doesn't mean you can't do that stuff, but it's also not the alpha male chest thumping, I've got to win all the time thinking either. But if we can create space for all of that to be there, part of what it does is it allows us to be better resources and allies in the world. Now, let's be clear. So what are some of the impacts? Well, there's a lot of patriarchy in our world. That we can't deny that. The Me Too movement several years ago, right? That's a result of unhealthy masculinity. And that's where, and I don't often like to use the term toxic masculinity because I think that is a very small subset of it. But how do we help people really start to lean into what's more expansive and healthier masculinity? And it can show up in different ways. I mean, I love getting out and riding my motorcycle and going to the range and doing that kind of stuff. But I also love having some other things that might be considered more feminine, whatever the heck that is. Because ultimately it's not feminine or masculine. Those are just energies. But it's also, I think the thing that keeps me going in it is it's made me a better father for my daughter. So she's 14, just started high school. And she's really one of the reasons that I wrote this book and I'm doing a lot of this work is because I grew up, I just turned 52 this year. And so for a large part of my life, there was a very narrow way that masculinity was viewed. And I thought that's what it had to be. And my daughter is showing me that there's more to how people can show up. And so I realize I'm going a little far afield from the question. You can bring me back. But I think what I'd come to is we've got to find what the right balance is for us. And it's never one size fits all to say you've got to be this certain way to fit. But how do we allow people to do what they need as long as they're not doing harm to others and really create space for finding themselves? Because I'm even discovering what does masculinity mean for me now and how is that changing and evolving too? So I'm not sure if I answered the question. If not, you'll ask me again. I trust that.
Well, I had a small subset curiosity that just kind of peeked behind the curtain for myself. Is, and we don't have to go too far down this tangent unless you want to, but you said you're 52 and you have a 14-year-old, so that means you were a 38-year-old first-time dad. Did I interpret that right?
Yep.
So I
think so if I did the math right, but yeah, sure. Yep.
So 38-year-old first-time dad. I'm 38. My son's 2.5, so a little bit in the later game, and we're pregnant right now with our daughter as well. And I just think about the life that you've had before a dad compared to the life that not even compared, but that led you to this place. There's a lot of dads like they have kids early in life, but they didn't really know how to become right. a father or be, they birthed a child. So therefore they became a dad. So I find it interesting because the wisdom that I have now, in my late 30s compared to what I was in my early 20s, I feel like that's a different version of Mike. And I think that's that there's truth to that for you as Christopher. So what is your take on men entering into parenthood in their early 20s that are just figuring shit out and they're messing up their kids because they're still kind of kids themselves. And it's now they're in their late 30s and they have a teenager versus men that are starting out in their mid to late 30s and then they're in their 50s and have a teenager. It's a different type of wisdom and energy and relationships and understanding thyself. Maybe there's something there. Maybe there's not, but I don't know if there's something for you to riff on with that framework.
Yeah. I think I'll also say it depends on the individual. Because I met a guy who was 30 years old once and he had an 8 or 9-year-old kid. And he was probably one of the most mature people I've ever met, more mature than some people I've met in their 50s and 60s. So I think in one sense, it's partially the person, because I became a father later in life. It's hard to say, honestly, me at 22 or 23, I yeah, I did not need to be a father. I knew I always wanted to be, but you're right. I don't know that I had that wisdom and that experience. But I'm not one to say you should wait till a certain age too, right? Because everything happens for a reason. And one of the gifts out of becoming a father for me is I learned a lot about myself. And ultimately, I think that's the first time I truly experienced unconditional love. I've been in relationships that were loving before, but even those weren't unconditional love. And so it had me really explore who I was and how I wanted to show up. And, I was raised by a single mother. My parents divorced when I was 4, so I never really had a father figure in my life. So for me, because my dad was absent all the time, I knew when I became a father, I was going to be all in. And there was no way my daughter was not going to know I was going to be there for her. And so that shifted my approach to it. But I also came with a little bit more experience in life too. And frankly, there's a lot of stuff that I don't stress about that probably me 15 years earlier would have been losing my mind over. So, I think that's also true in life in general. You know more at 40 or 50 than you did at 20 or 30. And it informs you. And sometimes you've made bad decisions, sometimes you make good decisions, but it's all ongoing information. And so I think it's, it largely depends on the person. And I also say the example they had of parents growing up. Because if you had a good example of what loving, involved, engaged parents could be, that's going to influence how you show up, regardless of what age you enter into it.
Yeah, it's so good. And I was joking with Mike in the chat. We have a little chat sidebar,
Right.
And I was like, so what you're saying, Mike, is that you're not going to screw your kids up the way I did. Because you're 38 now, and you're so wise. And Andrew had kids when he was 27. Okay, fair enough. I see how it is. You two got me beat. You're better.
Well, the cool part is, Andrew, you're like, yeah, but I've learned some lessons you haven't yet. So stand by, Mike. Like, just stand by.
That's certainly true.
and before I kick it to you, Andrew, the reason why I asked that question is because I'm the youngest of 8. Now 9. We had a surprise brother that my dad had because that we didn't know about from the genetic testing.
That's a funny story, by the way. You guys actually hung out with him too, right? Like you guys did a trip together with him.
Yeah. He's a great dude, Chuck. So, but the reason why I bring that up is because I think about my dad, who's 82. So he had me when he was 43, but he had my oldest brother who's 21 years older than me. And I could see the version of dad that my brother Barry got compared to who I got. And I think about the same thing with my other brother who's 20 years older than me. My nephew is 3 years younger than me. So I became an uncle at 3 years old. So just seeing like the dynamics of several of my siblings having kids earlier in life and seeing where they're at now, and then just seeing where I'm at now. It's just an interesting, I don't know if there's right or wrong, but there is an interesting thought there because we were raised differently, and with I think circumstances change and evolve and whatnot. So that was the reason for my question. It wasn't a jab at Andrew at all, but it's kind of funny.
I know.
Not that he's worried about it at all. Yeah. Well, I think another factor too is, I've talked to men that have been, have several siblings too. And, you also evolve as a parent, like they say the first one's made of glass, the second one's made of rubber, and the third one's made of stone or something like that. Like you treat the first one like they're made of glass, and then like you kind of get less and less worried about all the little things. So that could have been a factor. But I also think something that the role of fatherhood is changing in our world now. Like you go back a generation and it was very much, maybe even a generation and a half, like it was the Mad Men type of mentality. Dad went to work, made the money, came home, and it was like, just wait till dad gets home. And now there are a lot more men wanting to be involved and expected to be involved. And so I think how we're being held as fathers also changes the narrative as well. So there's a lot of nuances to it, but I think that's a factor too.
Yeah, I love that. And, definitely experiencing that. We are letting our second born be a lot more wild and crazy. And I think that tracks. One of the things that you talk about, you advise, you're an executive coach, you're a leadership coach, you're a consultant. You work with, really successful people, Christopher. One of the conversations going on inside the society is inclusive leadership. I know it's something that you talk about. Earlier, you mentioned the idea of gender equality or gender equity, something like that. And then obviously your experience as a Black man in the society, might be something that also is relevant to this conversation. I also, there's an interesting Supreme Court case that was recently, came out, right? The ruling, and it was the end of affirmative action. I haven't really had too many conversations with Black folks to understand what their take is on that. I actually wouldn't mind getting into that with you. I know you like to get vulnerable if that's okay. So just in general, talk about inclusive leadership, talk about why you think it matters, and kind of your take on that, whether it's on the gender side or the racial side or any side. I'd love to get your take.
Sure. In the last probably 2.5 years, I've been doing a lot of work with leaders and leadership teams around creating more inclusive spaces. And, usually here in the US, when we talk about inclusion, people immediately go to race because that's one of the biggest things here. But it really crosses a big spectrum of things. It's about gender. It's about racial identity. It's about ethnicity. There's a number of things. And what I love doing is bringing in this idea of vulnerability, even though I didn't used to explicitly say it, because sometimes people would hear the word vulnerability and they'd be like, yeah, okay, good, thanks, bye. And that would be the end of that conversation. Now we're in a space where I can bring it more. But what I found is a lot of the leaders that are wanting to create more inclusive spaces in their workplaces, so first of all, there's an economic benefit to it. Organizations that are more diverse have greater returns due to innovation. They keep their people longer. They have less turnover. There's numerous ways that it has a fiscal impact on an organization. So a lot of leaders are recognizing the importance of creating more inclusive spaces in their workplaces. But where they struggle often is they know they want to create these spaces, but how do they do it? Because we also have a significant cancel culture in our world right now. And so if somebody is trying to do something and they say something wrong or do something wrong, we just tear them down. And so as a result, they just say, I'm not going to say or do anything then, because then that way I can't be, hung on a cross for it. That's probably not a thing I should say. So I probably should find a different phrase. But what I really love doing is helping them recognize that, first of all, that idea you talk about failing forward, but helping people just show up being more human. And starting with, I want to do better. I want us to do better. I don't have the answers, and I'm willing to be in the conversation, can be so powerful in creating the space and maintaining it. And so that's a large part of what I do. I talk about helping leaders kind of adopt what I call the cave mindset to help them come out of their cave, but as a way of creating safer spaces that have more psychological safety, because when people feel psychologically safe, they're willing to be in the mess a little bit more. And, it's not about there's one perfect right way to do it, because that's a fallacy, because every individual is different. But how do we allow for spaces that let people show up as themselves, but also not exclude others because of it? And that's the challenging balance. But I love doing that work because it lets leaders feel more human. It lets their people see them as more human, and it allows them to see the people that work for them as being human. And ultimately, that creates more connection.
One of the things that I would love to hear you speak to, you're a former Marine is what your bio says, but once a Marine, always a Marine is what
Absolutely.
I've been told. So,
thank you.
And thank you so much for your service. I mean, we've had some really unbelievable people on the show who have served this country, and I just want to say thank you for all of our listeners and our community for your service. Because if you don't do what you did, then we can't do what we do. So, just want to make sure that you understand that. I would love for you to just, I would love to hear that chapter of your life that led to now, because I think there's too many people that I've come in contact with. Like I spoke at schools and juvenile detention centers and some of these urban areas where their only options are like go to the military or like sell drugs or go to jail, right. And the military sometimes got more selective with who they were even picking. So it wasn't even like they had too many options for these urban areas that I was speaking to during that chapter of my life. And one of the faculty even told me, she said 50% of these kids are going to graduate and the other 50% of them are going to be in jail. It's just like, that's what it was. So me being around that just gets me interested to see who you are right now, and looking at your bio to who you were. Like, where's that transition of like, I went to the military. Was that by choice? Was that by circumstance? That would be my first curiosity.
Right.
And like, if you could speak to that for some people, that is by circumstance or by choice. And then leaving the military of saying, this is who I came out of the military as, because some people that leave the military are depressed, angst, like they're just so PTSD because it's like, I was so mission driven on everything, and then I have no mission anymore, and nobody telling me what I'm supposed to be doing.
Right.
It's like this down is really tough. So they lose that purpose. So I don't know, whatever, if there's something there that you could speak to, I'd love to hear your take on it.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, I went in by choice. So I knew I was going to go to college. So I went in and got my commission. So, a good friend of mine that was in the military said, listen, if you're going to go in, remember that shit rolls downhill. So like the higher up the hill you can be, the better. And it was like, okay, I like that idea. So I spent 9 years in the infantry, loved it. It was a great experience. Like I always say, I miss the Marines. I don't miss the Marine Corps. And anybody who's been in the military can relate to that. It was a lot of hurry up and wait and bureaucracy, but it was a great experience. What I will say is it helped me learn who I was. It helped me learn that I am capable of far more than I think I can. Even going through basic training with the Marine Corps, like you do things that you didn't think you were physically able to do. And so it really helped me learn a lot about what I was capable of and how I could push myself beyond limits. And it also helped me really see what were some great examples of leaders and some not so great examples. My first company commander, if my phone rang right now and he said, Christopher, pack your bags, I'd be like, Roger that, sir. And I don't need to know how long we're going to be gone or where we're going. Like that's how much trust and respect I have for that man. And another commander that I worked for, if he said, hey, Christopher, I'm in town next week, want to get coffee? My response would be, ooh, I'm getting my hair done. Sorry. Because he was that not example of a leader. And, so where I'm going with this is it helped me really understand what the importance of leadership, because also really good leaders are creating other leaders as well. They're not just creating followers, but they help other people aspire to become leaders where they want to. So spent 9 years in the Marine Corps, did a tour in Iraq. And, when I got out, I knew it was time. I'd been fortunate enough to have 2 different company commands, but it was getting to be a faster deployment cycle. So I'd have been gone more than I was home. And I just got tired of all the things that I was missing. There were weddings, there were family birthdays, there were holidays. And so I was at a point where, I've done the things I wanted to do. It's time to move on. And I enjoyed it. It was a great experience overall, but I knew it wasn't for me long term. What I will say is the military is an amazing experience for some people. I spent 3 years on recruiting duty as an operations officer and executive officer. And there was one young man I remember in particular that, like, when he came in, we had to work to get him in. Like, he had some challenges in his past. And I remember seeing him come back about a year later. And the transformation in this young man was amazing. And I truly believe it helped save his life. So it can have a place. But I always tell people, don't just go into it and become a robot. Like, yes, there's an importance of following orders and discipline, but also being able to think for yourself. As you spoke about some of the people that get out and struggle sometimes, absolutely. So there's a lot of PTSD that I think we are giving more attention now than we used to. Like, I think back to my father was in Vietnam. And, you think about some Vietnam vets, when they came back, they got spit on coming home. That wasn't my experience. So I can't even imagine how that would mess with your head. But it can be a transition. I know when I got out, it was hard because I was used to, if I tell somebody to go do something, it's going to get done. I don't need to go check on it because I know that's the way it happens. Whereas in the civilian world, like, you have to help somebody see the motivation of why they should do it. And you can't necessarily directly, it's a whole different thing. And some people, I work with a lot of veterans that are transitioning too. I volunteer time with that, helping them make that shift because it is a very different world that we're in. So that's also a factor as well. And there was something else I was going to add that you were asking about with the military. I think my military experience really helped me. I think the biggest lesson I learned is this idea of improvise and adapt. And with that, like in the Marine Corps in particular, but all the branch service, like, we plan. And you always know that we used to say the first plan never survives first enemy contact intact, because the bad guys don't know what we expected them to do. And so as long as you have that mission that you're ultimately trying to achieve, you can look at, okay, so what's the information that I'm getting now from the scene, from the battlefield? How do I need to adjust and make decisions at a lower level so that I can still execute that commander's intent? And so that really helped me to step into a lot of places and go, okay, I'm pretty sure this is where I want to get to. I don't know that I've got all the things in place, but I'm going to find a way to get there. And so it's really helped me, I think, step into places that I wouldn't normally with confidence, knowing that I'll figure it out or I'll recruit people that can help me.
Yeah. And what a great lesson for life, and what a great lesson for business, improvise and adapt,
Right.
Constantly evolving, markets and staff and needs and,
Right.
Prices and all of those different things. And I'm sure that works its way into the executive coaching and leadership that you provide. At the end of our episodes, Christopher, we always ask our guests 3 questions.
Mm-hmm.
The first is, what do you think the world needs most today?
Well, I wanted to go into that song, that Burt Bacharach one, What the World Needs Now is Love, Not Love, but that's a little cheesy. You know what I think? Here's what I'd say. What the world needs most is, I'm going to say 2 things, patience and compassion. We very much want everything instantly. We're like an instant gratification thing, and it doesn't always happen. But we also need to have compassion for other people. And I think that will help us stop seeing so many differences and start look for some of the places that we have more similarities and things in common. So that's my answer to that one.
It's great. And Christopher, what are 1 to 3 books that you think people should read? I know you seeded one earlier. So
Sure. So the first one that I always recommend to people is Atomic Habits by James Clear. Love that book. That's part of what helped me write my book. So Atomic Habits. I will also say there was a book called All In by Josh Levs. And he talks about fatherhood and parental leave and, how the role of dads and working dads is changing. So that's another book I'd recommend. And then one that's going to be a little bit of a left tangent, but one that I read recently, it's called Honest Sex. And it's by a woman named Shana James. And while the title seems a little provocative, which is part of why I love it, it's about communication, more honest communication, not just in romantic relationships, but just in general. And yes, she does talk about sex too, which is something that we as men usually don't. We get all squirrely and squishy about. So those are 3 books I would recommend. Nice.
I love it. That's a new one. We'll have to check that one out. So this is really good, James. Sorry, I was looking at something else. Christopher. Real quick, Hector, edit that out.
Yes. That's all good.
Real quick.
I was talking about James Clear, so that's why I had James on the brain.
Yeah. Okay. Hang on. I apologize, Christopher.
No worries.
All right. Cool. 3, 2, 1. And question number 3, Christopher, that we always ask is, what does it mean to you to be better than rich?
Ooh, the first thing I think of is my daughter. So it's just, what does it mean to be better than rich? I will say it's knowing that you've made a difference and that you've left things better than you found them. There's a quote that I have on the bottom of my screen that I always love, and it says, "The work an unknown good man has done is like a vein of water flowing hidden underground, secretly making the ground green." And it's from Thomas Carlyle. And I think that one really just sums it up. So that's what it would mean to me.
Very beautiful. Christopher, I'm sure people are going to listen to this episode and they're going to want to stay in touch. So I know you have your book. I know you have your podcast. Can you speak to where people can learn more, get access to your information, to your resources?
Sure. So if people want to learn more about the book, The Whole Man Evolving Masculinity, they can check out wholemanjourney.com. The podcast is The Vulnerable Man, and that's vulnerable-man.com. Or if you just search up The Vulnerable Man, you'll find it. And then for my coaching and other stuff and speaking that I do, it's Echelon Left, ECHELON-left.com, like the military formation. And you can find me on LinkedIn. You'll find me because it says Vulnerability Vanguard in my title.
Well, I love it, Christopher. This has been amazing. Thank you so much. Listener, do check that stuff out. And assuming that this episode helped you in some way, it's your turn to help others as well. Share this with a friend. Subscribe to our channel on YouTube. Leave a rating or review on Apple or Spotify. And remember to leave today better than you found it. Until next week, we'll see you then. Thanks, everyone.